visiting fellow in the Center for Values and Social Policy at the University of Colorado.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. I think I queue up my PowerPoint. Thank you. So I just want to first thank Brian for inviting me to be here today. My perspective, and I'm very happy to be on a panel called Misinformation in Society, to be able to share more of a social or global perspective. My background as a comparativist in political communication and political science, and in terms of international security, makes me look at the question of fake news more comparatively, internationally, and a little more globally than maybe some of the other panels here today. So I wanted to just have a few just introductory remarks to give out, maybe thought provocative, maybe not, about my perspective on what the problem of misinformation is, and really where we should be looking, and maybe we're looking at some places, and not looking at others we should be, and then turn it over to my panelists. So, one discourse on the problem of misinformation, that's a technology problem. Right? That's a problem of the rise of social media and the internet, of these distributed networks, where we have people who use social media sort of somehow are then more exposed to fake news or misinformation, and that basically have become platforms for falsehoods, both in terms of exposure and sharing. This is a discourse that's often dominant in a lot of the circles I travel in terms of the State Department and public policy and international and DoD, Defense Department, when looking at how to handle this both domestically and internationally. But I would argue that is very much a technologically deterministic sort of view. That's really technology sort of driving misinformation. I would argue that technology is mere reflection of society, and we adapt technology to our societal needs. And we even had, and so really the fundamental driver of misinformation or disinformation is not really a technology problem. We're not going to solve it through a technology problem. Any type of tweaks or differences, new algorithms, people are going to adapt to it. You close down Facebook pages and people start using what's up. They'll start using means. So they'll adapt technology to suit their goals and purposes, and technology actually reflects in many ways how our society is functioning and characterized, and thus I think really we need to look elsewhere and not talk about technology. So not the problem. Another sort of focus is, well, the psychology. There's a lot of research in academia and government policy about the psychology of misinformation, disinformation. Why are we vulnerable? Why do we not update and correct our beliefs? Why do some people believe disinformation about vaccines or misinformation about elections? How do we correct that? How do we have better messaging and communication, better formats? How do we have better journalism in terms of the psychological aspects? And I would again argue that, and as my colleague just a few minutes ago, and I'll give a hat to him, Kelly Garrett so said, human psychology has been sort of stable or the same for thousands of years, so why now? So if it's a psychological issue driving disinformation, has our psychology changed somehow? I think not, though I think, again, psychology plays a role in probably figuring out how to treat the symptoms of disinformation, the symptoms of the problem, but it's not going to actually attack maybe the underlying causes when it comes to the amount of disinformation and misinformation in our society today, in our information systems, and how it's influencing both our behavior at the micro level, but also our politics at the macro level. So again, I would say no to that. Psychology. So what is the problem? And I guess from my perspective, and I want to lay it out there for discussion, and I would love to hear feedback, and it's something I've been trying to look at in Europe comparatively in several different countries. I would say that the problem of misinformation is more at the macro level. I'd say it's really about society, right? That really it's a problem of dissatisfaction of democracy. There's a lot of research about how a lot of political dissatisfaction about how core democracies in Western Europe and the United States are functioning. It's an issue of economic and social inequality. It's an issue of populism. It's an issue of not trusting established sources of information like the mass media and perceiving media bias, a lack of institutional trust. It's a problem of polarization and effective polarization, where basically we have become more tribal, our society, we're focusing more on our political identities rather than maybe in terms of identities of difference, rather than shared identities based upon family or community or nationality, and we focus on these sort of more identities that split us apart than bring us together. We focus on angst over globalism after cultural change and economic change in this global environment, issues of migration, free trade, regional unification, for example, in Europe, the EU. So these are the issues I say that, from my perspective, at this moment, why do we see a problem of disinformation and misinformation across from medicine to politics to science? I would say more it's a reflection of some of these underlying key social, political, economic trends that are driving people to adhere and be more vulnerable to disinformation, to want to believe in disinformation, to be more likely exposed to disinformation, less likely to trust sources, accurate factual sources, and be more open to sources of information and anti-system actors. I mean, a lot of this is driven by the politics in terms of whether it's the National Front in France or the AfD in Germany or the UKIP party in Britain is some of the research I've been doing on how anti-system actors who use disinformation, misinformation for their political gains. That is a reflection of our dissatisfaction to anti-globalism and societal breakdown rather than actually technology or psychology. So that's where I sort of want to end it and sort of throw it out there. Probably could have said it a little more artfully, but that's sort of my point, and I would love to hear feedback from my panelists and you all today. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erik. It's a real pleasure to be on a panel with you and with Alex, and thanks to the organizers. And I'd like to give a special shout out to Team 3597 Communications, a lot of students who are here. The single best part of my being at Ohio State this year has been getting to know the absolutely fabulous undergraduates at this university and have a chance to interact with them. So 3597, thanks for coming along, everybody. If I have a little bit of a deer in the headlights look about me, it's because I've been a practitioner in journalism for the last 40 years, and I don't know what the hell to do about fake news. And if you guys have an answer for that, let me know, and I'm going to try to implement it at some point down the road because it is really vexing. But because it's right after lunch, and Stephen, we're going to cue up that video if you don't mind and do it right here at the top. I want to show you, just for fun, my very favorite bit of Russian fake news from the last couple of years. You're really going to wonder where I'm going with this. Has anybody ever heard of a company called Fathead and knows what Fathead does? Come on, you younger kids might even know. What's Fathead? Do you know? That's interesting. That's not what I had in mind, but I don't doubt it. The response was a brewery. Yes? Yes, that's what I had in mind. No offense to the brewery, good idea. Fathead is a sports paraphernalia company. And one of the things that they make is great big decals, stickers of things like monster trucks. And kids get these and put them up on their walls in their bedrooms. Now prepare yourself for this segue. Just park that for a second, okay? A couple of years ago, Russia One, the main channel in Russia, state-owned, aired a 90-minute program lamenting and complaining and warning about how American homosexual propaganda is perverting Europe, destroying traditional gender roles, and weakening European society. And the segment presents as evidence a Western grade school biology textbook, and the foreboding music plays in the background, and the anchor states that Western children are, quote, forced to learn everything there is to know about sexual intercourse and are told to pick which gender they would like to be. And the segment then cuts to a video. Now here's where Fathead comes back in. The video is a double fake news. There was an advertisement Fathead did that was taken genuinely from a home video that a family had done where a young guy comes into his bedroom, sees the decals up on the wall, and just melts down. He is so happy. He can't believe he has these things in this room. And this commercial is so bad that it provoked an entire genre, a meme of people making parodies of the commercial. So the Russians took one of the parodies of the commercial and put it up as a part of this program as though this was an entirely legitimate video showing a typical American family at home. Now we're going to start about 45 seconds before the actual video shows, so you can just get a little bit of flavor of what's going on here. So you can bring the audio up.
Первонаперво это должна быть хорошая семья, и в Норвегии убеждены, что гей-семьи могут быть такими же хорошими родителями, как и другие. Я знаю, что этот вопрос широко обсуждается в России и многих других странах. Мы себя так не ведем. У нас дискриминации по сексуальной ориентации нет.
Гей-парады для подростков уже норма, и не только в Норвегии. К первому классу европейские дети должны знать о сексе все. Учебные пособия, рекомендованные школам, иных родителей повергают в шок.
Очень большое место занимает в этих программах разрушение гендерных стереотипов. Человек, ребенок, может выбрать себе пол сам.
Эрозия нравов, порожденная за океаном, размывание института брака. Европа безропотно берет к примеру США. Неужели так должна выглядеть детская?
Страшный совершенно процесс.
I don't even know where to go from there. But if you all have a way out of this, let me know. And I'd like to talk more about the business of journalism, and we're going to talk a bit about media bias and how media bias fits into the issue of fake news, and I have a lot to say about that. But I think having thus entertained you, I'll go ahead and kick over to Alex, and then we'll get into the broader conversation. Alex, sorry to set you up that way, but good luck with it. Okay.
Well, I can pick up on what you were saying about right at the end about media bias or that topic. So we've been hearing in some of the earlier panels today that the concept of fake news is used in a whole bunch of different ways, and that it's not completely clear what it refers to. But one thing I've been thinking about a lot is the concept of bias, which I think is also very unclear. And I think when we accuse people at media outlets of bias, we often don't have a good idea of what we mean when we talk about bias. So sometimes people seem to talk bias. I take it when we accuse media outlets of bias, it's supposed to be a piece of criticism. It's supposed to be something bad, but it's not exactly clear what bias is supposed to be. So sometimes people seem to just think that having any point of view or bringing any point of view or set of values into a discussion is being biased. It doesn't seem, though, that that's something bad necessarily, to have a point of view or to come into a discussion with a set of values. Sometimes it seems like accusations of bias are just about accusing someone of having a point of view you don't agree with, so that any deviation from the point of view you have is thereby biased. But that doesn't really seem like a very productive notion of bias to have. It doesn't seem like it's a non-partisan conception of bias. We might want our conceptions. We might want to have a concept of bias that makes it possible for us to agree on whether a media source is being biased without having to settle all of our political disagreements. And if by bias we just mean I don't agree with this, then we can't do that with the notion of bias. And sometimes bias seems to be about selectivity. Sometimes talk of bias seems to be about selectivity, what a media outlet chooses to cover, whether it gives the whole picture, as people sometimes say. But even that, it's not exactly clear what kind of selectivity is supposed to be biased. So all media outlets are going to have to be somewhat selective in what they choose to cover, and they're going to have to be guided by their values in deciding which stories to cover. And so again, it's not clear that selectivity kind of in and of itself amounts to bias. And you know, there are all sorts of other conceptions of bias. Sometimes people seem to think bias is about being completely neutral between all disputing perspectives or something like that, giving equal time to different points of view. Again, though, it's not clear that bias is something bad if we understand it that way. So, you know, so one kind of salient example here is that at least for a long time, much of the US kind of prestige media, when they covered stories to do with climate change, would, in the interests of so-called balance, report dissent about the existence of and causes of climate change. But the fact that they were doing that every time they talked about climate change kind of suggested that there was a lot of scientific disagreement about the existence and causes of climate change. And that contrasts very much with how media organizations in many other countries have treated the issue of climate change. And if that's what's meant by balance, it's not obvious that it's a good thing. And even then, again, media outlets can't cover every point of view. They can't give a platform or a space to every point of view in disagreements. And so they have to decide which points of view to include in the conversation. And so there has to be some kind of decision about who's kind of in the space of reasonable discussion. And so again, it doesn't seem like this kind of just be completely neutral and balanced between all points of view kind of idea is going to work. So I'm kind of interested in whether we can come up with a better notion of bias. And basically, I think that it's in some way going to have to come down to thinking about not just about the content of what gets reported, but the kind of motivations for reporting it. When media organizations are selective in order to kind of deliberately filter their audience's evidence in a way that furthers their political agenda. But that kind of notion of bias is going to be hard to detect. It's going to be hard to always know whether an organization is being biased or not if that kind of comes down to knowing their motivations, which is something that's hard to know about. And to kind of just tie that back into fake news, one of the questions that's being discussed today is kind of how broad our notion of fake news should be, whether it should just be confined to kind of outright clear falsehoods, just like demonstrably false claims, or whether it should be somewhat broader than that. And I think at least that it's worth distinguishing fake news from biased media coverage. So I think there are three things to distinguish. There's fake news, there's biased media coverage, and then there's just media coverage that in some way embodies a point of view that you don't like. And I think it's important to distinguish all three of those things. And I think one of the reasons that I sort of favor a notion of fake news that doesn't just say all biased coverage is fake news is that I think it kind of, including biased coverage or even coverage you just don't like as fake news, it kind of allows you to play on an ambiguity, because people do associate fake news with false news to a certain extent. And so when they hear you describe something as fake news, they'll often infer that you're describing it as false. And so it kind of exploiting this kind of ambiguity of what fake news means allows you to portray stories that you merely or coverage that you merely disagree with in some way, or think has been made the wrong decisions about which news to select to cover or something like that, as actually being false. And I think that kind of slide is dangerous. But I think people kind of often kind of literally don't distinguish between content that's actually false and coverage that they object to in some other way. And I think that's something that we all need to be more reflective about. And I'm thinking here of people on all sides of the political spectrum. So I hear a lot of people on the left describe Fox News as kind of full of lies or something like that. But if you look at what Fox News says, often, to the extent that it's objectionable, it's not that what it says is literally false. If you look carefully at what it actually says, it's usually not literally false. Sometimes it will be reporting something that someone else said that might be literally false, but it will say so-and-so said that, whatever. And most of the objections we have to it are to its selectivity or to its values maybe, but not, I think the issue is not that what is being said is literally false. And so I think kind of if we want to work towards non-partisan ways of assessing fake news and bias, we need to model that by being consistent kind of across the spectrum and saying, okay, I object to this, but I admit it's not, what's being said is not literally false. But so the kind of project I'm interested in is working towards non-partisan ways of assessing fake news and media bias. And that's a very challenging thing to do. And I'll just mention one last thing before we kind of discuss together, which is that, and it relates to that last point, which is that, earlier on we heard about teaching epistemology, and we heard about, trying to persuade people to follow the evidence rather than follow their guts. But I think a lot of the disputes about fake news and about media bias don't come down to one side saying, well, we care about the evidence, and the other side saying, we don't care about the evidence, we just care about following our guts, but come down to different evidential standards and different views about which sources are reliable. And so both sides do think that they are following the evidence. And that's part of what makes it so challenging to come up with non-partisan ways of assessing media bias, because so much is disputed. You have your fact-checking sites, but the trick of a good conspiracy theory is that it has an explanation for everything. So it will say, yeah, well, the fact-checking sites say this story is false, but those fact-checking sites themselves are just in service of the great conspiracy or something like that. And so that's what I think makes coming up with non-partisan ways of assessing media bias and fake news so challenging. So I'll stop.
I just want to say one quick thing. On the issue of media bias, I often, as someone who does a lot of comparative international work, it's interesting because perceptions of media bias in the United States, or how we define media bias in the United States, is very different from what actually is the global norm. In the sense that we have a recent tradition, which is actually only about 70, 80 years old. If you look at how media was in the United States 100 years ago, you wouldn't recognize it today in the sense that all media was biased. We had left, Democrat media, Republican media, left or liberal or conservative, and a lot of different media had a point of view, and it was only sort of a recent invention in our media ecology in the United States in the last 70 years where we thought of that media should be nonpartisan. If you look at the global norm, most media is partisan on one end or another. Exceptions might be the broadcast media in Great Britain, some of the media in Scandinavia and like Germany. But for the most part, when you look at newspapers and online outlets and most of Europe, especially Southern Europe, the rest of the world, media lines up according to political parties, economic interests, or other social interests. It's not nonpartisan. It is always biased. It always has a point of view. The question should not be whether media is biased or not. It should be whether it's accurate or at least factual or not, I think, is more of the question. The idea that media always is biased. The question is, what is the bias? So, and my second part of that is, media bias does play a role when it comes to misinformation and fake news, in the sense of when an individual believes that their media, or at least the mainstream media, is biased, and this is based on research and data we've collected in several different countries now, they are more likely to endorse disinformation or misinformation because they are more likely to counter-argue it or select partisan sources or other online sources which would be outlets for such misinformation. So either directs their behavior from a selective exposure or makes them more resistant to accurate information. So media bias does play a role as one of several different types of perceptual screens in terms of how people process information or might selective into sources that are less accurate than possibly the mainstream media. That's definitely true in the United States. It's partly a product of sort of the narrative that the liberal media versus the conservative media. But I think if you look at those who basically, and we have researchers here at OSU, have looked at how when people self-select into partisan news on either the left or the right, they're going to have less accurate perceptions as compared to maybe more mainstream sources. So these are some of the dynamics, I would say, when we talk about media bias, I just think we should put on the table.
So if you're trying to answer Alex's question about what might be a constructive way to go about this, reverting to the way media was in the United States 100 years ago, where it was openly partisan, would probably not be your answer? Or
I'm not saying it's the answer.
Well,
I'm not saying it's the answer. I'm just saying we need to put it in context when we mean by media bias, and also that we actually might be reverting to how it was like 100 years ago. That what we have now is maybe unique compared both historically and globally.
yeah, I would agree. And I'm going to make I would make the situation even slightly more complicated. But first, I wanted to be sure on that Russian thing I showed that everybody understood. There's a deeper theme here, and those of you who don't follow Russia closely, one of the big propaganda points of the Kremlin is the decay of values in the West as they describe it, and the threat to traditional values. That's why they put all that kind of stuff up. That's why they're doing that kind of programming there. But the issue of bias is complicated because I'll tell you, after 40 years in the business, and that does not include my time at the Lantern, by the way, people don't go into journalism because they're happy with the status quo. Full stop. They don't. I've never met people who went into the business for that reason. They go into the business because they see injustice. They want change. They're pissed off. They want to do, well, there are two things that our journalism is meant to do in our system here in the United States. One is we often just refer to the first draft of history to report what's happening. And the second is to challenge power, to hold power accountable. And that is a powerful attractant for people to come into the business. In my own case, I was studying physics here at Ohio State, and Watergate happened and really turned me on. It turned me toward journalism. My calculus grades also turned me toward journalism, but that's a separate discussion as well. So what it comes down to for the individual who's practicing this craft, this profession of journalism, is ultimately about the ability to hold that passion sufficiently in check to ensure that you're practicing the business at the highest possible level of professionalism. I mean, if you look at the front page of the Washington Post, if you look at it online, or if you look at the print edition, what does it say on the front page right at the top every single day? I mean, talk about attitude. What's it say? Does anybody know what it says at the front page of the Washington Post? Democracy dies in darkness. That's attitude. There's a bias in that, if you will. And I'm all for that bias. I mean, I'm biased in favor of our institutions. I'm biased in favor of our society. I'm biased in favor of our values, if you want to have the discussion at that level. But holding this sufficiently in check to make things work properly, to create credible content that is ultimately trusted content, is a big challenge. And journalists, to be fair, have huge self-inflicted wounds on this subject that makes it a lot more difficult. Social media has been a blessing and a disaster for journalists. Journalists who sort of hid behind reporting the facts and did the best they could are now out on social media putting out very strong personal views. They shouldn't be doing that. Their media outlets almost all have policies saying they shouldn't do that. They do it anyway, and it just hands one to those who are their opponents and who criticize them for saying, how can you possibly say that they can be unbiased in their reporting, because look what they've just posted on social media. The blurring of analysis and reporting, front pages of newspapers, if you all remember what newspapers are, used to be the sort of stories on the front page, the facts, if you will, and the analysis off someplace else. It's all blended together now. Where does it stop and start? That's a self-inflicted wound by journalists. And there are other ones as well. And believe me, the opponents of journalists have really focused on that. And they focused on it for a number of reasons. I threw the quote out this morning, and I'll give it again before turning back to my colleagues. And this is Steve Bannon saying in a panel earlier this summer moderated by Michael Lewis, he says, the Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media. And the way to deal with the media is to flood the zone with shit. Okay, they're doing a pretty damn good job of that, and they're taking the media down with them. Another big challenge is that the media, legitimate journalists, are so challenged by refuting fake news that they find themselves unable to do fact-based reporting, enterprise reporting, the things on which they used to spend most of their time. They simply don't have the time to do it. And I love the response of Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, when he was asked also at a panel this year whether or not the Washington Post was at war with the administration. His answer was, we're not at war, we're at work.
I do want to push back on one element of what both of you were saying. So, so as the philosopher, it's not going to be like disputing the empirical details of anything you said, but just about the kind of conceptual framework for how we think about it and how we think about bias in particular. So, both of you sort of equated bias with just having a point of view. So you said all media has a point of view, so all media is biased. So the question is not who's biased, but who's accurate. Or that's what you said, Erik. And I would not want to say that just having a point of view amounts to being biased. I don't think that that's how we use the concept in ordinary speech. I think you can see that from the fact that most people describe the other side as biased, but not their own side. And that suggests that but they know that they have a point of view, of course. And so, but they don't think of their own side as being biased. And so I think they think that bias involves something more than just having a point of view. And so I would want to resist the idea that bias is just about having a point of view and try and think about ways in which we can develop a notion of bias such that it really is, because having a point of view isn't something bad, especially if it's if it's clearly and kind of openly stated. And I would want to think about ways of thinking about the concept of bias that do actually pick up on the idea that calling something biased is a form of criticism.
Yeah, I agree with you. I accept your clarification. You said that very well. I think it's not a question of having a point of view. It's sort of what you do with it and how you manifest it in the way as a professional you do your job. And that's the balancing act for the journalist. Is that.
But I would push back a little bit, both of you, in the sense that when it comes, for example, Jeff, you talk about professionalism, but again, comparatively, we have a very high level of professionalism in the United States compared to the global norm, right? So when we talk about journalistic professionalism, we're talking about the exception, not the norm, globally, right? A lot of people become journalists, even in Europe, that have no journalism training, right? There are a lot of media outlets that are closely aligned with either political parties or other economic interests, right? And a lot of people become journalists who don't necessarily go to a journalism school. I mean, there are countries that have journalism schools, but again, if you look globally, that's often not the norm. And so we can talk about professionalism as a solution, right? So maybe professionalism is one solution, as you said, to dealing with the media role in misinformation, right? Maybe we need to have more professionalization that then deals with internal biases, but at this point in time, we don't have that, right, outside the United States and some European countries. The other thing on bias, I think the issue of bias is often, one element of bias, I think, is self-interest, right? And so in a lot of cases, you have a lot of media, including the United States and other places, that have a self-interest in promoting their point of view, right? So as you said, and a lot of media, even in the United States, have certain economic interests. So bias might not be partisan, it might be simply economic or normative in terms of they accept certain, when it comes to points of view of what's inside and outside. I mean, there's lots of research on media criticism, on media sociology, that looks at some of the inherent biases of our mainstream media outlets, whether it's Washington Post or New York Times. There is a sort of common sense point of view in terms of norms, what's inside and outside. And if you look on the left or the right, there's often criticisms that they're accepting certain economic models, certain social models that are inherently sort of communicated in their content and sort of they buy into. Now that's not to say, so I guess I'm saying is, if you want to differentiate between bias, you can talk about biases that shape their point of view, what topics they focus on, how they talk about certain topics. But I guess what you're saying, it's beyond bias in terms of, are they representing the factual nature of that? So I think it's starting to sort of get a fine cut of there's the facts, there's the point of view. That's become famous now. The famous Moynihan quote: "You're entitled to your opinion, but not your own facts." Right? And I think that's the question where there used to be in the United States, at least in the last 20, 30 years amongst mainstream media, there was different points of view, different biases, but they agreed on certain facts, right? There might be different interpretations of those facts, but they agreed on some factual basis. We got to the point where there's no agreement on the facts, There's alternative facts that people are talking about. So I think that's where we're at, and I don't know how that's, maybe bias has evolved, or what we mean by bias, but it's moved the goalposts, and when it comes to both mainstream media and partisan media in the United States and globally on how it's communicated what we mean by bias. I think something we need to grapple with.
Mm-hmm. So as a journalist, I appreciate your comments about the professionalism in American journalism. I got to take a slap at it, however. This is another case of self-inflicted wounds, and part of it has been due to the development of technology in the digital era. When I was working for U.S. News and World Report magazine, and it was a weekly news magazine, I had a lot of time to think about the story I was putting together, had plenty of time to go back and talk to people a second time, had 2, if not 3 editors questioning what it was I was doing and how I was going on about it. I had copy editors who'd probably served as guards in Gulag at some point. They were so tough about making sure you got everything right in an article. And then you had lawyers looking at it all before it went into print to make sure you weren't going to get sued for it. I don't know where that exists today. And by rushing out content with single source, journalists are again handing victory to those who wish them ill. They've almost every single day swallow the bait of something that's been handed out by somebody who knows it's false. They get it out, they put it up online, and whether it be the administration or officials or heads of companies can then come back and say, oh, that's completely wrong, and it discredits the journalist. So how to get out of that trap, I'm not sure, but the issue of professionalism and what that means today is something that needs to be addressed in the context of the realities of the environment in which they're operating today. And if you will, this is a little bit of the good news story of the fake news discussion, because I feel it's forcing people who are serious about journalism and serious about the integrity of the profession to have, about a decade later than it should have been had, a serious discussion about the implications of all the technologies for their profession and how best to utilize them, not just to cope, but to actually make it better. And those conversations are happening now in a way that I don't think they were as seriously even a couple of years ago. So that's the little bit of the silver lining in this, if we all make it from the here to there to a better quality of professionalism of journalism out there.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something you said about using sources. One thing that I think it's important for us to kind of resolve is whether it's okay for a news organization to just report report something false, but kind of in indirect speech. So to say, according to so-and-so, X or Y or Z thing happened. And whether they can, if it turns out that X or Y or Z thing didn't happen, whether they can defend themselves by saying, well, we were just saying that so-and-so said this. Mm-hmm. So like, for example, recently there was a story, Fox News covered it in the Kavanaugh hearings, about one of Kavanaugh's accusers, her ex-boyfriend accused her of having threatened to kill his unborn child. And Fox News covered this. And so is it enough for Fox News to say, well, we're just saying that the accuser said that, we're just saying that the ex-boyfriend said that the accuser threatened to kill his unborn child? Or do we actually want to hold Fox News to the standards of saying, no, that's not enough, you've got to actually check out that what was said by this person was accurate? And the same thing happens for, the same kind of question arises for social media too, right? Like, are you responsible for the veracity of what you share on social media? So when you retweet something without comment, or when you post something on Facebook without comment, are you kind of accountable if it turns out to be false? Or can you just say, well, I'm just saying that this is what some other person said? And that's kind of a question that I think we need to kind of get clarity on in order to know who to hold to account for fake news and for false news.
I would just say in that case that's obviously Fox News has a point of view. It has certain goals, I think, politically, and that's their choice to focus on that, right? They made a strategic choice to do that, right? So that's, and maybe, but that's again them exercising their point of view in a very partisan point of view. But that's something that I would say that in most cases, in a lot of other countries, that would be just normal everyday news, right? That's what you do. You put out your point of view, you choose what topics you focus on, and you go from there. I do want to step back for a second, because we're talking a lot about media organizations, and going back to my original comments, I just think that part of our conversation, and maybe we can do the Q&A, it'd be great to talk about, well, what other than media organizations and perceptions of media bias, trust in media organizations, the role that media organizations play in giving us accurate information is obviously a big part of this question. But again, it's reflective of a larger sort of political and social ecosystem where part of it is driven by polarization. Why does even Fox News exist, right? It's driven by these more political trends. Why is there such dissatisfaction with our politics and not only in the United States, but globally in a lot of democratic countries? Why is there such rise of anti-system parties that want to basically tear down the system, right? The rise of authoritarianism, anti-globalism. All this stuff sort of ties into misinformation, because often these are the tools of anti-system parties. These are tools of authoritarianism. Actually, a lot of fake news and misinformation techniques were developed in places like Russia and China for domestic purposes, not for weaponization overseas, right? To basically create a complacent and misinformed and compliant populace. So I think we need to think about this in a larger context, and sometimes we lose the bigger picture by focusing on some of these individual sort of institutional questions, psychological questions. So I just would throw it. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Well, we heard a couple of times in the good panels this morning about our own institutions of democracy being used against us, and I think there's no question that our adversaries are doing this at a very high level of skill that we're perhaps only coming now to appreciate. But the handwriting's been on the wall for some time. There's been some discussion over whether or not there was something called a Gerasimov doctrine or not, but there's no question that Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, wrote a very interesting article in 2013 in which he said the following: the role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown, and in many cases have exceeded the power of force of weapons in their effectiveness. And he goes on to write, and this is the Army guy writing this, okay? This is not a propagandist. This is a soldier. He goes on to write, asymmetrical actions have come into widespread use, as in they're already there, have come into widespread use, enabling the nullification of an enemy's advantages in armed conflict. Among such actions are the use of special operations forces and internal opposition to create a permanently operating front through the entire territory of the enemy state, as well as informational actions, devices, and means that are constantly being perfected. I mean, what else do you need, folks? You know, they're all in on this. They are all in on this at every level of our society. And I've been watching these characters for decades now, and I have no doubt that they're doing it as effectively as they possibly can. The truly odious Dmitry Kiselyov, who runs all their media operations now, including Sputnik, the foreign operation, said it very clearly as well last year. He says, today it's much more costly to kill one enemy soldier than during World War II, World War I, or the Middle Ages. If you can persuade a person, you don't need to kill him. So there's the persuasion option, there's the confusion option, and these are both being played out in a big way. So they're throwing an awful lot at us through our own system that we're in no way prepared to defend against. And we should talk about ways that we might be able to defend against it, because there are some ideas that we could put in play. But there's no question in my mind that we're way behind the ball on this one, or only beginning to appreciate and I've just mentioned the case of the Russians, but the Chinese have been extremely active too, and there have been other state and non-state players who are doing their own things. And you can't ever make it through a conference without quoting The Art of War. I mean, you have to quote that in every conference that's ever been held anywhere. So leave it to Sun Tzu, writing 2,500 years ago, the greatest victory is that which requires no battle. Full stop. So, okay, we are in that environment right now, and we're swimming in it, and I think just starting to figure out what's going on, which needs to segue to getting to the solutions for it.
Did you want to put any of that?
I don't have a lot to add, and I guess we should be throwing it out to questions soon, but I'll just say one small thing, which is that, yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that the questions we're raising about the media and media outlets, media organizations are sort of mirrored at a broader level, and I guess to kind of generalize the question that I'm particularly interested in, the question, how do we have a kind of non-partisan conception of media bias or of fake news, really as part of a broader question, which is how do we talk to each other rationally in conditions of just extreme disagreement, where people don't share common premises, and where, because each side has been exposed to a different set of evidence, and that's partly because of selective media coverage, each side has kind of different starting premises, and each side, because they've been exposed to their evidence and not necessarily the other side, thinks that they're the kind of rational ones.
All right, now we're going to, we have time for questions, and so I will be moderating, so please, if people have questions, yes, go ahead.
In terms of the bias, right, in terms of, you mentioned economic ones, which I think are really important, which I don't hear many people talking about this, and I wish there were more socialists here, Marxists, because Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, and Democracy Dying in Darkness, catchy, really nice, but we have the forces of capital who own the mainstream news organizations in this country. They are invested in the status quo. They are invested in people not rocking the boat, not wanting to agitate too much. I don't believe that journalists, once they get caught up in that system, are there really to fight for much except their own job. And so if you could say a little more about that. Also, in terms of the history, you made a point about technology not being the problem or the issue, and I think that's right, but what about what happened in this country and really globally, after the Vietnam War and the war being in your living room, pulling back the veil a little on what goes on and getting people to sort of understand that these institutions and these figures are maybe not telling everything. I don't know if you're familiar with the documentarian Adam Curtis's work, his hypernormalization that came out in 2016. Maybe you could say a little bit about that and about narrative, how he makes sense of this. It's about managing perceptions now, and it's not about giving us thing like that, that are deliberately confused so that we can manage their perceptions, and that so the forces of capital can continue to do their thing. And I guess from there.
So, again, this is the difficult situation we find ourselves in today. Traditionally, those capitalist institutions in the American media model in the 20th century were held in check, if you will, by the need to have media organizations that were commercially profitable. They wanted that. And part of being commercially profitable and attracting and retaining audience was being credible. And if a media outlet gained a reputation of being not credible because it was pushing just one particular point of view or being sloppy about the news, even if that would be supporting the point of view of the capitalist, then the media outlet loses money. So capitalist arguments end up working against interfering in the content of the media outlet. I would submit that that has broken down to some extent today, again, as we get into a situation where it's a bit more of a free-for-all. So that sterling reputation of being I'll go ahead and say unbiased or credible, doesn't go as far as it did before, so it's potentially more of an issue. What I've found generally works, though, is that in a media organization, because journalists are the kind of people I described, and you all know journalists, I'm sure, that when that kind of pressure comes from someplace, they're not going to remain silent about that, unless they get specifically hired to work there and they're okay with that. There's been a lot of criticism of Sinclair buying up local media stations and the moderators going along with whatever the line is coming from on high. Certainly the managers of Russian media outlets follow the line that comes down. And if you want a real example of what happens when the oligarchs run the media market, look at Ukraine, which has an extremely rich media environment today. No market that can possibly commercially support all those outlets, but the oligarchs do it because they're their political mouthpieces. So that is a model that you have to appreciate when you're consuming a particular Ukrainian media outlet, and oh, that belongs to so-and-so, so that's where this particular thing is coming from. So there have been these kinds of checks and balances within the American system, but I think and the journalists I know at the Washington Post say Jeff Bezos has been a good boss so far. That has not been an issue there. I think if it is an issue there, we'll hear about it. Rupert Murdoch, maybe not so much, as he's bought up American media outlets. So it's one, I think you're correct to flag it as something we definitely need to keep an eye on.
I would just say when it comes to the 1960s and 70s, I do think that was and there's been people who have written about this, how that was a time of transition when it comes to how people's relationship with government and authority, right? Going beyond sort of Vietnam War and the role of TV, I would say that really all that happened within a context of cultural and political change in the 1960s and 70s, right? And that was a reflection of that. You have the Pentagon Papers, you have Watergate, and that sort of the role where the media was playing this role of fourth estate as keeping government accountable and transparent. That at the same time, that was more about the sort of institutional role of the media rather than technology. And I think that also played into the underlying social and cultural changes where you had a lot of, starting in the 1970s, there's people written about the rise of cynicism, how people's relationship and view of government as being up on a pedestal and unquestioning authority started to break down, right? And I think the media played a role in that because it was reflecting the social and cultural change that was going on at that time. But at the same time, just as people's attitudes towards governmental authority starting in the 60s and 70s sort of break down in terms of being more cynical or less trusting, I think the same thing happened with the media, like the media as an institution. It was more people questioning institutions in general. And that's actually to the point where today, I think in many countries, including the United States, but also in Europe, you have a crisis of faith in both them, in established political parties, established media sources, established government institutions. That's partly driving this crisis of faith and the rise of populism, and this distrust is partly why people are more vulnerable to alternative sources of information. Yes. Or normalizes it, yeah.
That gets back to the question of professionalism. Journalists need to be better prepared to do their jobs, and if you're going to take on an interview with a controversial figure, go into that interview ready to do it. You know, I'm intensely disappointed by the quality of some of the interviewing I see done where public figures are not pinned down because the journalists don't have command of the facts as they walk into the interview. That's happening too.
But I think the economic model of journalism changed where that professionalism hits economics, right? And I think the role of news in even these larger entertainment conglomerates, right? So news is now supposed to be a profit center, right? So the role of news is not to inform. That's not the priority. It's to make money, right? And I think that has also changed. That there's been a change in the organizational norms of news organizations since the 60s and 70s. Now, and I think that's why you see the softballing, right? You don't see the level of professionalism that you would otherwise want to see.
Yeah, tough, because in the economic model, of course, newspapers were a cash cow for a long, long time. There was no other place for you to find out about the sale on steaks at Big Bear except in the Columbus Dispatch, right? So for a long time, newspapers had a really sweet ride, and they were very profitable things. And it made it easy to support the elaborate news operations that they supported. And so certainly with the coming of the corporate takeovers and things, we've seen a real change in that. I would use that as an opportunity, and turn back to Alex then, to make a plea for one of the solutions is we need to patronize quality journalism. And that, guess what, means paying for it. So get over your aversion to paywalls. Journalism is not free. If you're not going to pay for it through a subscription or through breaking a paywall, somebody else is going to pay for it. You know, the commercial market for traditional media outlets has dried up because it's all gone to the digital side. It's all gone to Google. It's all gone to Facebook. The money's not going to the media outlets. So if you don't want the oligarch calling the shots, if you don't want the corporate interests calling the shots, if you don't want the state calling the shots, you got to pony up, folks. You got to say, to get quality news and information, I'm going to make a commitment, and I'm going to actually spend a little money. And I say this in particular to the younger generation because I think, and I don't blame that growing up digital, you're just accustomed to just having all this stuff there. You got to get beyond it. To make the model work, you have to patronize it and pay for it. I hate to say it, but it's true.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think there are two kind of competing, to some degree, explanations of the sort of slanted coverage you're describing. One is a kind of model where you think, an explanatory model where you think, okay, these news organizations are owned by, you know, say Rupert Murdoch or whatever. Rupert Murdoch has his own political agenda that he wants to push, and so then the journalists within the organization, in order to keep their jobs and so on, are incentivized to push Rupert Murdoch's political line. Another explanation of it is that it's consumer demand led from the start. So these organizations start by having a conservative consumer base, and therefore what's most profitable for them is, and what ends up being the incentive for them to cover, is to push a more and more conservative line as that base gets more and more conservative, and it's kind of a circle. Those, I think, are different explanations. I don't know which one's right, but I think an interesting question is about to what extent we let, an interesting ethical question is to what extent we let the second thing be a sort of excuse. So if people say, well, the reason we're doing it this way is because it's what our consumers want, whether that's a kind of defense or not of that kind of coverage.
Other questions? Yes.
A little bit about the democracy being undermined argument. I've been around a long time. I've been through a lot of political campaigns. And although the word wasn't used, it seems to me all campaigns are wall-to-wall fake news. The incumbents are always distorting their voting record and their opponents the other way around. And so people are basically used to this. They get it obviously in advertising. Very few Toyota ads say, by the way, Mazda actually makes a better car. So essentially, if there's a lot of fake news or really fake news or people dribbling in on Facebook, the result is just basically the fake news is being piled higher and deeper. And so the ultimate savior in this is the caveat emptor, and the emptors are pretty sophisticated. I mean, starting at the age of 2, you start to figure out who's a phony and so forth. And in terms of most discussions of campaign advertising indicates it doesn't make any difference anyway. People, you can say anything you want, and people still vote the same way they would before. And the number of products that are successful are incredibly small. 90% fail. In the case of high-tech products, it's 95% fail. And also, virtually all, as I think I may have, all political campaign studies indicate that advertising doesn't make much difference one way or the other. It's basically trivial.
Can I answer that on the advertising? I agree with you, but we're not talking about advertising, are we? We're talking about news or fake news or presented. So there is lots of research that shows, and especially in research in advertising and marketing that looks at what we call native advertising, when you have some type of native advertising on an online website, for example, presents something that looks like a news article, but it's really an advertisement. That is much more effective than an actual explicit advertisement. Yes, we have our guards up when we see political ads. We don't have our guards up when we see a news article per se. So there's psychologically, it makes a difference. And there's research that shows that basically native advertising is more effective than explicit advertising because of something called perceived persuasive intent. You only need to have small effects to actually have a meaningful effect overall, especially in our sort of electoral system. So from a political persuasion in close elections, persuading 1% of the people who are exposed to something like that might make a difference in a close election. It's close enough when you're talking about millions and millions and millions of votes, right? And especially when we have an electoral system in the United States that's sort of split up by state, where actually it doesn't take a lot of votes in a particular state to change the electoral equation in terms of electors. I would also say, though, the way that disinformation, and you look at more globally in Europe, the way it undermines democracy is not necessarily in elections, all right? The way that Russian disinformation attacks, for example, Eastern Europe, and I'm working with groups there, is not so much about trying to persuade people to vote for one candidate or not. It's all the research shows, and most of actually the state-sponsored disinformation in the United States is about creating contention, polarization, tribalism, where basically the system is so gridlocked and breaks down because of the political contention. It's trying to there's research that shows where basically when it comes to vaccines, Russian disinformation is trying to gin up both sides of the debate just to get people yelling at each other. And so where democracy breaks down, and the research shows democracy breaks down, when there's high levels of polarization in society. That is one of the key factors in basically democratic backsliding. And that's where disinformation comes in, is when it creates greater levels of polarization and political gridlock, then you actually have democracy functionally undermined. And it's happening. You can have some levels of polarization, but basically, in terms comparatively, when you have high enough levels of polarization where democracy ceases to be effective, or it creates the opportunity for anti-system actors, like you see a lot in Europe, then you actually, yes, have democracy can be undermined. You can there's probably a healthy level of polarization, but there's also an unhealthy level of polarization. And that's what a lot of the disinformation campaigns in Europe and in the United States are focused on creating.
We had some discussion this morning with the two good panels, and perhaps the panelists would want to speak up again on this issue about the importance of media literacy. I don't know a great deal about it, but it certainly seems like a good idea. I have read accounts about Finland in particular, and the northern tier European countries introducing very early in school curricula media literacy coursework to try to make people more discerning consumers of news and information. And again, this morning's panelists may include people who know more about this. I do know that when I look around in the parts of the world where I've worked in the last 20 years in U.S. international broadcasting, and in particular the former Soviet space, the Russians are targeting those environments where media literacy is the lowest because it's the easiest to make a quick difference there with their disinformation products. And by and large, those are the southern tier countries. We're talking about Bulgaria. I think there's no question that they made a big difference in the Macedonia referendum a couple of weeks ago, that Russian disinformation made a big difference there because they didn't get sufficient turnout to make the referendum legitimate, and the referendum was a big deal about anchoring Macedonia in Western institutions. So I have to say, as part of the solution, I'm attracted by the idea of media literacy to help sort the fake news issues in a discerning way. I suppose a long time ago this might have been called civics class, back when we taught things called civics class, how to understand how to be a member of this society, all the tools you need to be a member of this society. And this certainly seems to me like an increasingly important tool.
Sorry, I got too excited to ask you. Oh, no, no, go ahead.
So my question, we've already touched on it briefly, but I think it's important that we remember that media outlets are businesses, and the most important thing for a business is predictability. And what makes it what makes media predictable, because you have new stories constantly. So the only thing that can be constant, are perceptions on the reality around you, the representation of everything. And it seems to me as though you have media creating a false a false dichotomy, where it's one answer or the other, and one of them is wrong, and it generates so much revenue and so much ratings, so I'm wondering if there is a way that we can get past that that fallacy that there is only two options and one of them is, disaster.
Well, one part of predictability can be, and I agree with you, predictability is nice. When you go to your media outlet, you're comfortable with it. You know where to find the information that you're looking for and what's going to be there. But predictability doesn't preclude diversity in a media outlet. So the Washington Post, famously now derided by very important people in this country as being hopelessly liberal, features predictably and regularly on its pages columnists and others who hold very conservative points of view, including at least one who's a good friend of Donald Trump's. It is in the mix. So there may be those who are trying to pigeonhole the Washington Post as a liberal publication, but there is predictability in knowing you can go there or to the op-ed pages of the New York Times or to other media outlets and find the other view in the mix. And you can then draw further conclusions beyond that. So I understand the predictability thing. It's also a reason why, and again, I'm trying to talk about solutions here. I'm very much pushing in this terrific class I'm teaching, diversify your media diet. Get out of your comfort zone. Look at things that normally you would not look at. It doesn't mean you have to believe necessarily what it says, but expose yourselves to that point of view. So Maria's following Telesur, right? Which is very controversial Latin American media outlet. Deb, you're following Al Jazeera, right? And Leonie, I think you're following RT. So, I'm pushing them out of their comfort zone, and I hope that after they've taken this class, that they'll keep looking at RT. Why not? Let's get as much as we can, because some of the conclusions you may draw as an informed media consumer actually triangulates not only what RT is saying, but eventually you'll be sophisticated enough to appreciate why they're saying that particular thing. So I think that's the only real law, not the only real law, it's a part of a long-term solution. And I happen to do that personally through my Facebook feed. I have all kinds of stuff coming into my feed from all kinds of news sources, and I kind of look at it and triangulate. My wife Gretchen's even better at this, that she really has a broad, complex perspective and understanding of the news because of the diversification of sources that she's taking in. So that's my pitch.
And I would just say information literacy is a strategy being used internationally by foreign governments. Canadian Foreign Ministry funded a huge project in Ukraine with 16,000 participants on information literacy. Italy is starting a sort of fake news literacy program in high schools in its curriculum. So information literacy, more so than media literacy, but information literacy is actually a strategy that is being used both domestically and internationally as a way to sort of combat fake news. But again, I, in many ways, unfortunately, I think that treats more the symptoms than the problem. It doesn't treat the source. It sort of helps vaccinate us. It's sort of based on an inoculation theory, right? Maybe against fake news. But does it really treat in the end of the day, the source or the diffusion of fake news? So it's one part of it. And it's exhausting.
At least one of our panelists wants to get back in, perhaps to jump back in. Wait for the microphone just 1 second. Make sure everybody hears you.
There has been research suggesting that one of the few successful ways in reducing affective polarization, right, so Democrats hating Republicans, is to prime an American identity. And what better to prime an American identity than a common enemy? For example, a common enemy trying to undermine your democratic system. So I think that one part of this whole information literacy idea should be kind of being very explicit about foreign actors trying to influence things. And I think that's one narrative that can get people from the left and the right on the same side. So that's maybe a potential kind of intervention that might be successful given what we know about group psychology.
I'm not going to respond to that. I'm going to respond to the comments that you were making. So I think that the approach of diversifying one's media sources and triangulating is very important, but we should also be sensitive to the various boundary conditions, the various factors that shape how people consume that media. So we know, for example, that social exclusion, that anger, that arousal all color how people process information. When you're angry, you tend to stop paying attention to the cues in the news and start paying attention to the partisan cues that accompany it. And so if you're angry, I'm concerned that that diverse set of outlets that you're looking at isn't really going to help, because all you're really paying attention to are the partisan cues. At high levels of arousal, you're going to be more inclined to rely on some of these peripheral cues. And so one has to be careful. I'm not saying don't look at RT, but I am saying be aware of the conditions under which you are doing this consumption, because we are in an environment where you might be primed to process that information in ways that are less than optimal.
Good point. Oh, in the back, we have someone hand up there.
So I agree with Kelly's point there, as we talked about earlier in this morning. I mean, I think the ways in which it's important to understand the ways in which we process information and communicate that information online are often motivated, although we don't sometimes know it, not out of the desire to express, to convey facts, but to actually to express our emotions. That's perhaps in a sense the primary function of sharing content online, including news media, is to express emotion and tribally relevant emotions. By primary function, I mean the function that sustains the practice. People wouldn't be sharing stuff online if it didn't have that emotional function, I think. And I think that's really important. The other thing I point out is about sources is that, and this is a sort of a bummer of a comment, I think, but look, it was earlier noted that we are disagreeing over facts now, right? Not just over values, but we're also disagreeing over facts. But it's actually much worse than that. We're also disagreeing over which sources of facts are reliable, and even more than that, over the very standards of evidence that we use to assess facts. And once you start disagreeing over standards of evidence, it's extremely difficult to see how you can resolve debates. Because how do I defend my standards of evidence except by appealing to the standard of my standard of evidence? I'm not going to appeal to yours, right? And of course, you can rightly then say to me, well, you're begging the question. I question your standard of evidence, and you just gave me more evidence from that standard. And I'd be like, yeah. So you would be right to dismiss me, in a sense, from your point of view. I've just done the thing that you were claiming that I was guilty of. So, I mean, one way of illustrating that for you is, for folks, is to think about, just ask yourself, if somebody challenged you on the use of the scientific method, for example, to figure out the age of the Earth, how would you defend your use of the scientific method? Well, you would probably defend science by appealing to some scientific studies. Good luck trying to convince somebody of that. So I think, in a way, that's an unfortunate old philosophical problem that has become a sort of lived reality for us today.
I mean, so I totally agree with the second point, which I think I was trying to make myself less elegantly earlier. And I think a great illustration of this is climate change skepticism, right? I mean, it's just, as I was sort of briefly hinting at earlier, a really good conspiracy theory just has a way of explaining away any counter evidence that you might give to it as part of the conspiracy, and that's what makes them so hard to engage with. On the first thing that you mentioned about expressing emotions, I just wanted to tie that together with the question about advertising, and my sort of reaction to the question about advertising, both non-political and political advertising, is that well, it's not really fake news because it doesn't even kind of rise to a lot of advertising, not all, a lot of advertising doesn't even rise to the level of being true or false. It's just kind of trying to express a kind of attitude or convey a sort of emotional or affective association or something like that. And so it doesn't even rise to the level of being something that can be assessed as true or false or as fake or real. And then just finally, this is just like an anecdote rather than a deep point, but I was interested to read this week that apparently for the Facebook reaction buttons, when conservatives see liberal stuff when liberals see conservative stuff on social media, they click the angry face. But when conservatives see liberal stuff on social media, they click the laughing face. So, I don't know, just kind of interesting. Interesting pattern there.
Shannon, you had your hand up earlier.
So I guess I'll have to pick on you since my question was directed at you and you called me out. So I want to go to Eric's one of my professors, so it's fine.
I'm on the other end.
Yeah.
Fine anyway.
So I have a question about the premise where you presented that technology is not necessarily the problem, it's a societal problem. But through the panel discussion, we've highlighted on a few points about how the changing technology has sort of shaped the way that our society behaves. So people don't want to pay for journalism anymore. People expect information to come out quickly. And so in that sense, the technology is determining the way that society is behaving. So I guess for the entire panel, and I mean, I don't think I've changed your mind, but I'd like to hear your rebuttal to that point of, can we say that technology is not the problem when it is enabling a shift in the way that our society engages with information?
I would say that, and I would disagree, I disagree with some of maybe how it's been characterized by some of the other panelists. When I say technology is a problem, I'm saying it is a reflection of society, and how we use it is a reflection of society. So technology might enable us to do things better or more so, but it's not the driving force. The problem already existed. We're just letting us actually make the problem worse, right? And disinformation and misinformation existed prior to the rise of Facebook. If it wasn't social media, it was email. We have researchers have looked at that. If it wasn't email, it might have been fake news stories. The Russians were putting out disinformation for years during the Cold War, right? I think what technology has allowed is to make some of these cleavages in terms of the rise of polarization happen before social media, right? We had, Fox News came out in '96, right? Well before we had and internet was just starting to get going then. I think basically what technology has allowed us to, and has allowed society and the cleavages in society, populism, anti-globalization, anti-system actors, to be more effective at creating cleavages and using it as a medium for pursuing its goals. But I don't think technology in itself is the problem. Technology is a reflection on how we create the rules of technology, how we actually the laws around technology, and what we build into the technology, again, is a reflection of our social, economic, and political preferences and structures. So in that sense, technology, if it's part of the problem, it's just reflecting more underlying, more macro-social trends in that sense.
Yeah, if I could add just quickly, and I will be brief because Ty, I want you to get your question in for sure before the panel ends. Thus it has always been with technologies. You drive an automobile that probably will go 100 miles an hour. You don't drive at 100 miles an hour. You drive at the speed limit or something close to that. When Franklin Roosevelt had the radio, which was new, it was a hugely powerful technology that he took advantage of for the fireside chats. When Adolf Hitler was barnstorming to be in his election campaign to be elected and then wound up chancellor, he would swoop into remote German towns in an airplane and get out and give an address and get back in and fly away. The technologies blew people away that he was able to do that. So historically, we're just dealing with the next wave of whatever this is, and either we're going to get a handle on it or get used to it in the way all previous technologies have been gotten hold of one way or another, or we aren't. So jury's out on that, but I don't see it historically as being necessarily something revolutionary, although where we're sitting right now, it certainly seems like a pretty damn big deal, right?
It's a moderating variable.
There you go.
We do theory construction and look at mediation moderation. It's a moderating variable.
I know Ty has a question. Ty, do you have a question there?
So in a lot of the outlets where they tend to be a little more disinformation prone, a lot of their taglines, like, your InfoWars or your Breitbarts or, RT is even difficult of it, where it says, "This is the truth. We are giving you what everyone else is not giving you, the mainstream media," or, how do you convince someone who is consumed by this information that they believe that they are receiving the truth? Where you have someone who is prone to, whether they are, visiting these websites, someone in Ukraine where they had disinformation, but they're being told, hey, this is the truth. How are you able to really help them escape the echo chamber that is the disinformation?
Does either of you have something on that? I could say something on that.
I mean, I think this is the same question that it's a sort of more applied version of the question Michael was asking about how people with very different evidential standards can talk to each other. So, if someone just denies that, if you want to show that it's false, you have to appeal to your sources, and then they just say, well, I think those sources are garbage, and so then it seems like you're stuck in a kind of dispute, and I think that's really hard to resolve. I mean, I think there are some cases in which, so I think we should distinguish two kinds of case. One is the one where what they're saying is actually just a total lie, and they're presenting it as the truth. The other is where, and I think this does happen with people with outlets like Breitbart, they are saying something that's actually true, and they are saying something that wasn't reported by other media outlets. It's just that they're also excluding tons of other stuff that the other media outlets are reporting on. So they are being selective in their coverage to further a particular agenda. They would accuse the other side of having done the same thing. In that case, I think it's a little bit easier because there isn't such a dispute about the basic evidential standards. The answer is just, we need to say it's the media diverse, it's consuming a more diverse set of sources. We need to say, you're only getting one side of the picture from this because they have an agenda, and you need to consume other sources to get the full side of the picture. But when it's actually a dispute about the basic facts, it's harder to give that response.
I would just say, to put that point, I think it's a very good point. That's the insidious nature of a lot of the disinformation, these state-sponsored disinformation, that's focused on creating greater cleavages, more, whether you call it negative partisanship, affective polarization, tribalism, because then you are less likely to agree on common evidentiary standards. You're less likely to agree on common epistemologies, right? And so the more tribalistic, the more polarized, the less likely you are to agree on evidence and how to assess that evidence, the more we're divided. And so that's part of the logic and strategy, right? How do you get beyond that? Well, that is problematic.
I'll just add a couple of sentences, and I know we're wrapping up the panel now, but RT's tagline actually accurately describes what it does. What is RT's tagline? Have they seen their ads? What it says? Question more. That's what RT is all about. It's to sow the confusion. It's to make you think whatever it's to put you in this hall of mirrors, to put you in the psychosphere, as Peter Pomerantsev would put it. So it actually accurately describes what it does. There's a barrier of entry problem that you need to get over that Alex has touched on here, which is you need to break them out to start to consume your content. And one of the organizations that has a huge amount of experience in this is U.S. International Broadcasting, because during the Cold War, you had to break through to an audience that was consuming Pravda and Izvestia and watching Vremya every night at 9 o'clock, and that was all they had. So all of a sudden, here's this thing from the United States called the Voice of America, or Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Why should I listen to that? And if you can get them to start to listen, one of the most important techniques is to make sure that you're not just mirroring whatever that outlet is doing. So you never countered propaganda with propaganda. You countered it with something different. You provided alternative narratives. And you attracted an audience and you held them to credibility. You were consistent in the way you reported. You reported the bad news as well as the good news. The Voice of America this week's reporting and last week about Donald Trump's tax problems. Maybe there are tax fraud issues. Most international broadcasters of countries don't do things like that, but the VOA does. So as a consumer, if you can listen to it once, you're going to say, wait a minute, that is something different. Maybe I'll try it again. So that's how I understand it.
Yes, please. Well, I think, just personally, I'm not sure about, probably varies by platform, but when it comes to, for example, political advertising, I would prefer, and I think they've started to do this, that when it comes to political advertising, they're more transparent, much like is required at least on broadcast in the United States, for example. In terms of regulatory, I think that is a question. I do think they have gotten so big that as a society or global society, we do probably need more boundaries, and not let them self-regulate. So I'm personally for, at least, and that's a debate to be had. What would that look like? What needs to be done? But I do think there probably needs to be less self-regulation and more sort of formal regulatory constraints or boundaries put on a lot of the various tech platforms. I know Europe has been taking a lead in doing that when it comes to privacy. In the United States, we have lagged behind. So I think that's something, at least in the United States, we need to have more of a conversation about, personally.